I'm now an old man with a few stories to tell. Nothing much, mostly about nothing, as Seinfeld would say. But I'd like to leave a record of several UFO sightings I've had over the years. A few were lights in the sky, others a prolonged stationary view. Then there were the discs that seemed to be playing just under the clouds. At least one can be explained away as a possible deception. I'm using AI to record these experiences because I'm experimenting with videos after a life spent in and around the print media. And I don't want to talk into a camera. I have a raspy voice, not a radio voice. But the script for this video was written entirely by me. It's not a concept with the research done by AI. My most recent sighting was just this year, in February 2025, in Coon Rapids, Minnesota. I was putting groceries away in the car and happened to look up. To my amazement, I could see 3 dark grey discs playing tag. They would move towards and away from each other. My first thought was that they were balloons tethered together and maybe spinning around each other. But the more I looked, they appeared to be flat discs, and they would move toward and away from each other. It was like they were playing tag as they moved toward and away from one another. I kept watching. It was late afternoon and I looked around to see if anyone else could see this, but no one was leaving or entering the store. Finally, a woman parked her car nearby, and as she walked away, I called to her and asked her if she could see what I did. She did. I commented that they were like discs, not balloons, and she, in her own words, agreed they were flat. She asked how I noticed them, and I said I was putting groceries in the car and happened to look up. I'm not good at estimating distances, but these were just under the clouds that covered the sky that afternoon as a storm approached. I reported this sighting to the National UFO Reporting Center in case anyone else saw them. However, my initial sighting was long ago in Utah, where many UFOs have been seen over the decades. At the time, I was a police reporter in the late 1960s for a daily newspaper, and I was covering a fire. The blocks are 1/8 of a mile square in the original part of the city. I had walked down an alley to where several homes were in the interior of the block. When I returned to my car, I was surprised to see a large glowing white light descending from the northeastern part of the sky. It was above the Wasatch Mountains and coming down at about a 60-degree angle maybe. It was dusk, and as it passed behind the foothills on the north side of Salt Lake City, its bright glow backlit the mountain. Nothing else came from that sighting. There were no fires or flames visible in that vicinity. A year or so later, about 10 p.m. on a winter night, I was driving east on 4th Avenue towards University Hospital, and again I saw the same kind of glowing light come floating down at an angle from the east to that same area north of Salt Lake City, behind the foothills. I had to get to the hospital for a traffic accident story, so I could not stop and reflect on what I'd just seen. In my 20s and early 30s, I spent hours walking along that same hill on the north end of Salt Lake. I would follow game trails etched into the ridgeline and slopes by wildlife and humans over thousands of years. There are shallow canyons north of that initial hill, and one of those canyons is what those lights seemed to disappear into. The northern hillside was easily accessible when I lived in a walkout apartment across from the governor's residence. I will add that one time, as I passed behind some homes on the edge of development, I came across a circle of bent grass behind one of the homes. It could have been a nesting ground for deer, but it was a circle, and the grass was bent in a swirling pattern in one direction that followed the circle. Wildlife would have just matted the grass down. Maybe it was kids, or something with a power system that would leave an imprint like that. Since then, That entire hillside has been covered with homes so that people can enjoy the valley view without having to climb the hillside. After I was no longer working at the newspaper but still living in Salt Lake City, I had a Fiat Spider with a convertible top. One evening, I drove my dad from the home I grew up in to the Sugar House area about 2 miles to the north. In those days, the area was nothing like it is now, all developed and built up. But I parked in a large parking lot outside a store. He went in to make a purchase, and I sat in the car looking up at the dark sky as the top was down. I was shocked when something dark came flying overhead. It was going from south to north above 1300 East, which the shopping centre bordered. You could just barely make it out, its dark mass reflecting the streetlights below. It made no sound at all. It was no more than a few 100 feet above the ground, if that. Shocked by what I'd seen, I thought it was a plane that was about to crash, somewhere just north of us. A few years later, I learned of a book written by Frank Salisbury about UFOs in Utah, and the book included triangle-shaped craft being spotted in the Winter Mountains of northeast Utah. I could not tell if what I saw was triangular-shaped. It was too dark and passed overhead too quickly. But I suspect that's what it was. Which means it could have been a secret military craft experimenting with quiet propulsion, such as electromagnetic forces. Still one more interesting observation, interesting to me, and probably not believable to you. But it happened. In the late 1970s, we owned a modest split-level home in Sandy, Utah. My backyard bordered Dry Creek Canyon. It actually is a shallow ravine, not a deep canyon that extends from the Wasatch Mountains east of our property. Back then, I spent hours walking in that ravine with my Springer Spaniel. Sometimes riders on horseback would pass through it. I revisited that neighborhood more than 40 years later and was surprised how much vegetation had filled in since I remembered it. I'll throw in an unrelated incident about that canyon. Back in the 70s, I could go out my front door and walk eastward a few houses to an asphalt path that led between 2 houses down into the canyon. My backyard was fenced, so I'd go to the asphalt entryway and descend down to the floor of the ravine. Again, a true story, no lie. One late afternoon, as I began walking down that covered path, I first heard and then saw or sensed a bullet whizzing by me about 18 or 20 inches above and ahead of me. Then I heard a rifle shot. I took basic infantry training at Fort Ord, California, and I had bullets fired over my head during training exercises. So, I know that sound. I can't imagine anyone firing a bullet down that ravine, since there could have been children playing in it. But it was the time of year when a hunter might have been testing a rifle for deer hunting. I continued to descend, and there were no follow-up shots. I recall when I returned home, I told my wife about the incident. Soon after, thinking about that passing bullet, I figured out that if I had continued walking on a level path, my head would have been about where that bullet passed by. Instead, I had suddenly and rapidly begun descending down a steep path. If someone had been following me in his sights, he might have thought my path was level and ended up missing. More likely, though, it was more likely an irresponsible hunter firing his gun into a populated area. When I visited the neighborhood about 3 years ago, I discovered that asphalt path had been removed, and there was no space between the homes to access Dry Creek Canyon from where I used to. I did find a place to get into the canyon a block or two farther east. I looked around for a ledge or outcrop that a bullet might have been fired from, and it was apparent that once one got down to the floor of the ravine, they would be out of sight as the canyon twisted and turned. No idea what that was. But back on topic, I talk about Dry Creek Canyon because it was the scene of one more Utah Lights in the Sky experience. In the late 1970s, not long before I moved to Colorado the first time, I was standing on my back porch and looking up at a small white cloud that was motionless to the east above Dry Creek Canyon. It was mid-afternoon, I think. For some reason, I kept looking at that cloud as I hadn't ever seen a cloud that low. It was below the mountain peaks and more towards the valley, but still to the east and above Dry Creek. I was surprised to suddenly see 4 or 5 small white lights come from the north and into that cloud. I waited. They didn't come out the other side, the cloud had absorbed them. So I kept staring at that cloud for a few minutes. Then I saw maybe 2 or 3 lights whiz out of that same cloud and head south parallel to the mountains. That's all I remember. I guess I got bored and went inside, but that memory stays with me. One final incident from Utah long ago. My late brother told me years ago he and his close friend Scott, who lived next door, were outside playing in the dirt in the front yard of our home in the Mount Air Acres subdivision east of the old Villa Theatre, around 3100 South and Highland Drive. If there was some dirt, it might have been before they installed sidewalks and a sewer line along the front property line of the houses. He just said they looked up, and an object came down from the sky and was over them, and sparks flew out of it. That was the essence of his description. They would have been children then. I ran into Scott years later after my brother had passed away, and when I asked him about the day they saw a UFO and sparks, he confirmed it had happened. It was an out-of-the-ordinary experience that lingered in their minds. So those are some Utah and one Minnesota experiences I've had and want to leave a record of. But there's more. In another video about the high strangeness I witnessed surrounding a distant thunderstorm in southeastern Colorado in 2007, I added a UFO sighting I had one Friday night years earlier, around 1990, give or take a year, on Highway 96 west of Haswell, Colorado. That was a huge stationary object with a red light on one end and an amber light on the other. The not clearly defined object was maybe a half-mile or more in length. I won't go into it because after telling the county sheriff about it, and him telling me if I'd stopped, I'd been shot at with a laser weapon. Therefore, I won't repeat the story about that unusually large, unmoving object in the sky, as it was most likely a holographic projection to divert attention from whatever was going on nearby in a very isolated ranching area. It was included in my video recollection of a likely scalar weather experiment I witnessed in southeastern Colorado. Though there is one more sighting in Colorado, again, may be hard for you to believe, but this is not AI making up a story for YouTube, just me recalling unusual events from my memory. About the turn of the century, I bought a cheap telescope at a garage sale. I set it up on my patio in Aurora, Colorado, and used it to gaze at the craters on the moon. One late afternoon, about sunset, a full moon was in the eastern sky. I swear when I focused on the moon, I also saw 2 flat discs flying away from my viewing point and towards the moon. I've also watched jet fighters from behind in Colorado using my scope and binoculars, so I knew this was no plane. No glow from the afterburners, and a shallow, broad disc was the shape, not a fuselage with wings. It was a lucky coincidence, like the time my brother and I were camping at Bridges National Monument in Utah, and I leaned back against a rock slope and searched through binoculars for the source of a jet-like engine we could hear that afternoon. I spotted a missile zooming through the sky, and as I followed it, another missile suddenly came into view and struck it, and the missile started tumbling end over end to the ground. That was likely a test for an Earth-to-air missile from one of the military bases in the southwest. So what I saw in Aurora, Colorado that evening looked like two disks actually heading towards the moon, though I'm not sure if they were or it was a coincidence they were going towards it. As you know, our rockets to the moon launched from Florida and arc southward, some saying they just fall back into the sea, but the official narrative is they have to orbit the Earth and then head toward a rendezvous with the moon a few days away. Our rockets aren't aimed directly at the moon when they launch, but whatever I saw seemed to be. Who knows what technology we have or others have. Many of you have seen things too that aroused your curiosity. And when you tried to tell someone about it, maybe you were disbelieved or just smiled at. And there's a reason for that. Most UFOs are just lights in the sky, stars or high-flying aircraft, or a cylinder seen in daylight that was just a plane but you couldn't make out the wings because of the angle or lighting. There's a gap in my lights in the sky stories for the simple reason I'm not outdoors as much as in the past. And because, like most of you, I don't look up as much. But that is how you will have your own experiences. Be outdoors or on your porch and look up at the sky. Realized too many white objects in the sky, or probably a weather balloon like the one I saw one time driving in New Mexico, and a stationary white object I saw above Denver a few days before the Pope visited. About 4 years ago, in 2021, Judith and I were driving around during rush hour in a suburb north of Minneapolis. Suddenly, through the trees, we both saw a mysterious golden object that could be seen a few miles south between us and the Minneapolis skyline. We couldn't pull over because the two-lane road we were on was congested and moving along. There was no shoulder. When we finally got clear of traffic and the obstructing trees, whatever it was gone. We both agreed it was a strange thing to glimpse, and it was no longer visible in the airspace between us and the Minneapolis skyline that was about 5 or so miles away. Had we gotten a clear, stable view, it probably would have been easily explained away, but the object had such a bright glow. It was unlikely to be a reflection of a setting sun because the object was at the wrong angle and time of day to do that. And what we both agreed we saw was so vivid and bright, but in no way does it qualify as a UFO sighting. But that sighting brought to mind one I read in the National UFO Reporting Center files a few years back. Someone driving home after sunset during winter glanced over and said they saw a UFO hovering outside one of the tall buildings in Minneapolis. It prompted them to make an official report. People do see things. However, if most of your time is spent in front of a television or computer screen rather than outdoors in nature, you'll miss seeing something yourself.